Hey friends, today we're going to be reading some chapters of Island of the Blue Dolphins. This is our second group of chapters, so make sure you've listened to our first Island of the Blue Dolphins video so that you know what happened. Just as a little reminder, keep in mind that Karana had been very curious about the new visitors that had come to the island. They were, of course, led by a pretty, it turned out, evil captain named Captain Orlov, who was looking to cheat the island out of those otter pelts. Unfortunately, there was a pretty big battle where the people who had come, the Aleuts, they were called, to get those otter pelts, and it left Karana's father dead. So now we're going to see what happens after that really crazy last few chapters. Chapter 5. That night was the most terrible time in all the memory of Galasat. When the fateful day had dawned, the tribe numbered 42 men, counting those who were too old to fight. When night came and the women had carried back to the village those who had died on the beach of Coral Cove, there remained only 15. Of these, 7 were old men. There was no woman who had not lost a father or a husband, a brother or a son. The storm lasted 2 days, and the third day we buried our dead on the south headland. The Aleuts who had fallen on the beach were burned. For many days after that, the village was quiet. People went out only to gather food and came back to eat in silence. Some wished to leave and go in their canoes to the island called Santa Catalina, which lies far off to the east, but others said that there was little water on the island. In the end, a council was held and it was decided to stay at Galasat. The council also chose a new chief to take my father's place. His name was Kimki. He was very old, but he had been a good man in his youth and a good hunter. The night he was chosen to be chief, he called everyone together, saying, "Most of those who snared fowl and found fish in the deep water and built canoes are gone. The women who were never asked to do more than stay at home, cook food, and make clothing, now must take the place of the men and face the dangers which abound beyond the village. There will be grumbling in Galasat because of this. There will be shirkers. These will be punished, for without the help of all must perish." Kimki portioned work for each one in the tribe, giving Ulape and me the task of gathering abalones. This shellfish grew on the rocks along the shore and was plentiful. We gathered them at low tide in baskets and carried them to the mesa, where we cut the dark red flesh from the shell and placed it on flat rocks to dry in the sun. Ramo had the task of keeping the abalones safe from the gulls, and especially the wild dogs. Dozens of our animals, which had left the village when their owners had died, joined the wild pack that roamed the island. They soon grew as fierce as the wild ones and only came back to the village to steal food. Each day toward evening, Ulape and I helped Ramo put the abalones in baskets and carry them to the village for safekeeping. During this time, other women were gathering the scarlet apples that grow on the cactus bushes and are called tunas. Fish were caught and many birds were netted. So hard did the women work that we really fared better than before when the hunting was done by the men. Life in the village should have been peaceful, but it was not. The men said that the women had taken the tasks that rightfully were theirs, and now that they had become hunters, the men looked down upon them. There was much trouble over this until Kimki decreed that the work would again be divided. Henceforth, the men would hunt and the women would harvest. Since there was already ample food to last through the winter, it no longer mattered who hunted. But this was not the real reason why autumn and winter were unpeaceful in Galasat. Those who had died at Coral Cove were still among us. Everywhere we went on the island or on the sea, whether we were fishing or eating or sitting by the fires at night, they were with us. We all remembered someone, and I remembered my father, so tall and strong and kind. A few years ago, my mother had died, and since then, Ulape and I had tried to do the task that she had done, Ulape even more than I, being older. Now that my father was gone, it was not easy to look after Ramo, who was always into some mischief. It was the same in the other houses at Galasat, but more than the burdens which had fallen upon us all, it was the memory of those who had gone that burdened our hearts. After food had been stored in autumn and the baskets were full in every house, there was more time to think about them, so that a sort of sickness came over the village, and people sat and did not speak, nor ever laughed. In the spring, Kimki called the tribe together. He had been thinking, he said, during the winter, and decided that he would take a canoe and go to the east to a country which was there, and which he had once been to when he was a boy. It lay many days across the sea, but he would go there and make a place for us. He would go alone, because he could not spare more of our men for the voyage, and he would return. The day that Kimki left was fair. We all went to the cove and watched him launch the big canoe. It held 2 baskets of water and enough tunas and dried abalone to last many days. We watched while Kimki paddled through the narrow openings in the rocks. Slowly he went to the kelp beds and into the sea. There he waved us, and we waved back. The rising sun made a silver trail across the water. Along this trail he disappeared into the east. The rest of the day we talked about the journey. Would Kimki ever reach this far country about which nothing was known? Would he ever come back before the winter was over? Or never? That night we sat around the fire and talked while the wind blew and the waves crashed against the shore. Chapter 6. After Kimki had gone one moon, we began to watch for his return. Every day someone went to the cliff to scan the sea. Even on stormy days we went, and on days when fog shrouded the island. During the day there was always a watcher on the cliff, and each night as we sat around our fires and wondered if the next sun would bring him home. But the spring came and left, and the sea was empty. Kimki did not return. But the spring came and left, and the sea was empty. And there were few storms that winter, and rain was light and ended early. This meant that we would need to be careful of the water. In the old days, the springs sometimes ran low, and no one worried. But now everything seemed to cause alarm. Many were afraid that we would die of thirst. There are things more important to ponder, said Madasep, who had taken Kimki's place. Madasep meant the Aleuts, for it was now the time of the year when they had come before. Watchers on the cliff began to look for the red sails, and a meeting was held to plan what to do if the Aleuts came. We lacked the men to keep them from landing, or to save our lives if they attacked us, which we were certain they would. Plans were therefore made to flee as soon as their ship was sighted. Food and water were stored in canoes, and these were hidden on the rocks at the south end of the island. The cliffs were steep here and very high, but we wove a stout rope of bull kelp and fastened it to the rocks at the top of the cliff so that it hung to the water. As soon as the Aleut ship was sighted, we would all go to the cliff and let ourselves down one at a time. We would then leave in our canoes for the island of Santa Catalina. Although the entrance to the Coral Cove was too narrow for a ship to pass through safely at night, men were sent there to watch the cove from dusk to dawn, besides those who watched during the day. Shortly afterwards, on a night of fine moon, one of the men came running back to the village. Everyone was asleep, but his cries quickly awakened us. "The Aleuts! The Aleuts!" he shouted. It was news that we expected. We were prepared for it, yet there was much fear in the village of Galasad. Madasep strode from hut to hut, yelling and telling everyone to be calm and not to lose time packing things that would not be needed. I took my skirt of yucca fiber, however, for I had spent many days making it, and it was very pretty, and also my otter cape. Quietly, we filed out of the village along the trail that led towards the place where our canoes were hidden. The moon was growing pale, and there was a faint light in the east, but a strong wind began to blow. We had gone no farther than half a league when we were overtaken by the man who had given the warning. He spoke to Madasep, but we all gathered around to listen to him. "I went back to the cove after I gave the alarm," he said. "When I got there, I could see the ship clearly. It is beyond the rocks that guard the harbor. It is a smaller ship than the one which belonged to the Aleuts. The sails are white instead of red." "Could you see anyone?" Mataseap asked. "No." "It is not the same ship which was here last spring?" "No." Mataseap was silent, pondering the news, and then he told us to go on to where the canoes were and wait for him, for he was going back. It was light now, and we went quickly over the dunes to the edge of the cliff and stood there while the sun rose. The wind grew cold, but fearing that those on the ship would see the smoke, we did not start a fire. Though we had a meal to cook for breakfast. Instead, we ate a small quantity of dried abalone. And afterward, my brother Ramo climbed over the cliff. No one had been down to the rocks since the canoes were hidden, so we did not know whether that they were still safe or not. While he was gone, we saw a man running across the dunes. It was Nanko, carrying a message from Mataseap. He was sweating in spite of the cold, and he stood trying to catch his breath. We all waited, urging him to talk, but his face was happy, and we knew that he brought good news. "Speak," everyone said in a chorus. I've been running for more than a league," he said. I cannot talk." "You're talking," someone said. "Speak, Nanko, speak," cried many voices. Nanko was having fun with us. He threw out his chest and took a deep breath, and he looked around at the circle of faces as if he did not understand why everyone was staring at him. "The ship," he said at last, saying the words slowly, "does not belong to our enemies, the Aleuts. There are white men on this ship, and they have come from that place where Kimki went when he left our island." "Has Kimki returned?" an old man broke in. "No, but it is he who saw the white men and told them to come here." "What do they look like?" Alupe asked. "Are there boys on the ship?" asked Ramo, who had come back with his mouth full of something. Everyone seemed to be talking at once. Nanko made his face stern, which was hard for him to do because his mouth had been cut in the battle with the Aleuts, and ever since it had always seemed to smile. He held up his hand for silence. "The ship has come for one reason," he said, "to take us away from Galisad." "To what place?" I asked. It was good news that the ship did not belong to the Aleuts, but where would the white men take us? "I do not know to what place," he said. "Kimki knows, and he has asked the white men to take us there." Saying no more, Nanko turned back, and we followed him. We were fearful of where we were going, yet we were happy too. Chapter 7. We took nothing with us when we thought we would have to flee, so there was much excitement as we packed our baskets. Nanko strode up and down outside the houses, urging us to hurry. "The wind grows strong," he shouted. "The ship will leave you." I filled 2 baskets with the things that I wished to take: 3 fine needles of whalebone, an awl for making holes, and a good stone knife for scraping hides, 2 cooking pots, and a small box made from a shell with many earrings in it. Ulape had 2 boxes of earrings, for she was vainer than I, and when she put them into her basket, she drew a thin mark with the blue clay across her nose and cheekbones. The mark meant that she was unmarried. "The ship leaves," shouted Nanko. "If it goes," Ulape shouted back, "it will come back again after the storm." My sister was in love with Nanko, but she laughed at him. "Other men will come to the island," she said, "and they will be far more handsome and brave than those who leave." "You are all women of such ugliness that they will be afraid and soon go away." The wind blew in fierce gusts as we left the village, stinging our faces with sand. Ramo hopped along far in front with one of our baskets, but before long, he ran back to say that he had forgotten his fishing spear. Nanko was standing on the cliff motioning us to hurry, so I refused to let him go back for it. The ship was anchored outside the cove, and Nanko said that it could not come closer to the shore because of the high waves. They were beating across the rocks with the sound of thunder. The shore, as far as I could see, was rimmed with foam. 2 boats were pulled up on the beach. Beside them stood 4 white men, and as we came down the trail, one of the men beckoned us to walk faster. He spoke to us in a language which we could not understand. The men of the tribe, except Nanko and Chief Matasayap, were already on the ship. My brother Ramo was there too, Nanko said. He had to run on ahead after I had told him that he could not go back to the village for his spear. Nanko said that he had jumped into the first boat that left the cove. Matasayap divided the women into 2 groups, and then the boats were pushed into the water, and while they bobbed about, we scrambled into them as best we could. The cove was partly sheltered from the wind, but as soon as we went through the passage between the rocks and into the sea, great waves struck us. There was much confusion. Spray flew, the white men shouted at each other. The boat pitched so wildly that in one breath you could see the ship, and in the next breath it had gone. Yet we came back to it at last, and somehow we were able to climb onto the deck. The ship was large, many times the size of our biggest canoes. It had 2 small masts, and between them stood a young man with blue eyes and a black beard. He was the chieftain of the white men, for he began to shout orders which they quickly obeyed. Sails rose on the tall mast, and 2 of the men began to pull on the rope that held the anchor. I called to my brother, knowing that he was very curious and therefore would be in the way of the men who were working. The wind drowned my voice, and he did not answer. The deck was so crowded that it was hard to move, but I went from one end of it to the other, calling his name. Still there was no answer. No one had seen him. At last I found Nanko. I was overcome with fear. "Where is my brother?" I cried. He repeated what he had told me on the beach, but as he spoke, Ulape, who stood beside him, pointed toward the island. I looked out across the deck and the sea, and there, running along the cliff, the fishing spear held over his head, was Ramo. The sails had filled, and the ship was now moving slowly away. Everyone was looking toward the cliff, even the white men. I ran to one of them and pointed, but he shook his head and turned from me. The ship began to move faster. Against my will, I screamed. Chief Masase grasped my arm. "We cannot wait for Ramo," he said. "If we do, the ship will be driven on the rocks." We must," I shouted. "We must." "The ship will come back for him another day," Matasayap said. "He'll be safe. There is food for him to eat and water to drink and places to sleep." "No," I cried. Matasayap's face was like stone. He was not listening. I cried out once more, but my voice was lost in the howling wind. People gathered around me, saying again what Matasayap had said, yet I was not comforted by their words. Ramo had disappeared from the cliff, and I knew that he was now running along the trail that led to the beach. The ship began to circle the kelp bed, and I thought surely that it was going to return to the shore. I held my breath waiting, and then slowly its direction changed. It pointed towards the east, and at that moment I walked across the deck, and though many hands tried to hold me back, I flung myself into the sea. A wave passed over my head, and I went down and down until I thought I would never behold the day again. The ship was far away when I rose. Only the sails showed through the spray. I was still clutching the basket that held all of my things, but it was very heavy, and I realized that I could not swim with it in my arms. Letting it sink, I started off towards the shore. I could barely see the 2 rocks that guarded the entrance to Coral Cove, but I was not fearful. Many times I had swum farther than this, although not in a storm. I kept thinking over and over as I swam how I would punish Ramo when I reached the shore. Yet when I felt the sand under my feet and saw him standing at the edge of the waves, holding his fish spear and looking so forlorn, I forgot all those things I planned to do. And instead I fell to my knees and I put my arms around him. The ship had disappeared. "When will it come back?" Ramo asked. There were tears in his eyes. "Soon," I said. The only thing that made me angry was that my beautiful skirt of yucca fibers, which I had worked on so long and carefully, was ruined. All right, guys, that's it for this week. And next week, we'll find out what happens now that Karana and Ramo are stuck on the island. Take care.